The following video about meditation includes clips from an interview between Dr. Josephine Briggs, Director of the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health at the National Institutes of Health, and Dr. Richard J. Davidson, founder of the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds at the Waisman Center, University of Wisconsin-Madison. Meditation is a mind and body practice. Although there are many different types of meditation, from a scientific perspective, they may all have at their core the ability to train attention. A person who is meditating uses certain techniques, such as a specific posture, focused attention, and an open attitude toward distractions.
Every form of meditation in one way or another involves training attention. And if we go back to the beginning of scientific psychology, William James, in his classic tome, The Principles of Psychology, which was published in 1890, has a whole chapter on attention. And he says in that chapter, the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. And he later goes on to say, an education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. And so I think he had the intuition that that training attention was something really important for core skills of what it means to be human.
Most types of meditation originated in ancient religious and spiritual traditions.
I think in ancient times, in the original context in which these practices emerged, people did these practices really not for their direct health benefits, but rather for their impact on broader dimensions of well-being. And one can even say things like liberation, whatever that might mean.
Right.
There are reasons that I think are quite different from the intentions that motivate most people today in our modern cultures.
Pain, anxiety, stress, insomnia, depression, and the physical and emotional symptoms that may be associated with chronic illnesses are all common in today's society. And at the same time, statistics show that many people use mind and body practices on a regular basis. In 2012, 18 million people used meditation, according to a nationwide survey. Is there a connection?
So today we see people coming to these practices because they feel like they're overwhelmed. They're very stressed in their life. They may have chronic pain.
Quieting, yeah. To quiet the soul, or to
quiet the soul, to produce some modicum of equanimity. They often feel like their lives, as they currently are constructing them, are not working, and they want some kind of other strategy to help them cope with life's slings and arrows. Right. And I think that today we see that as really a central motivation for an intention for why people come to the practice, which I think is very different than 2,000 years ago. The central intention was really different.
For more information, please visit NCCIH.nih.gov/meditation.
Thank you all for coming to the annual Stephen E. Strauss Distinguished Lecture in the Science of Complementary Therapies. I think that brief video clips give you a sense of why we're particularly excited about the day today. This is the time once a year where we remember Steve Strauss, who was an extraordinary individual and whose wisdom and breadth of interests led through the founding years of the center that I now have the honor of leading. He was an extraordinary researcher, had extensive interest in basic and clinical research, including chronic fatigue syndrome, the development of vaccines for genital herpes, the management of post-herpetic pain, Lyme disease, HIV/AIDS, an extraordinary breadth of scientific interests, but also a range of interest in meditative practices, in religious and spiritual roots of the quest for health. And I think that the work that Dr. Davidson represents is the kind of work that Steve always thought was central to what we should support. So Dr. Davidson, is a great pleasure for me to welcome him. His lecture today is entitled Change Your Brain by Transforming Your Mind. He is the William James and Vilas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and the Director of the Waisman Laboratory for Brain Imaging and Behavior, and the founder of the Center for Healthy Minds at the Waisman Center. Many of you may have encountered Dr. Davidson before, as he has collaborated regularly with our center over the years. 2 years ago, he was contributed and helped our hosting of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who presented the annual Raul Lecture. Today, I'm pleased to say he's going to present to us an overview of the studies conducted in his laboratory, in which he's bringing real rigor to understanding the neural changes associated with different forms of meditation. So please welcome Dr. Richard Davidson.
Thank you so much, Josie. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be here today to deliver this Stephen Strauss lecture. I had the privilege and honor of meeting Steve on several occasions during his initial tenure as the director of what was then known as NCAM, and was always struck by a combination of his extraordinary basic humanity, which was palpable, and his brilliance. And those two together are unfortunately too rare a combination in science. And he was a wonderful role model, and I'm humbled and inspired to give this lecture in his honor today. So I'd like to begin by very briefly situating this work autobiographically. I'm a psychologist and a neuroscientist by training, and I've always been interested in one central question, which I began my career with and still very much motivates much of the work that we do. And the question is simply, why are some people vulnerable to life's slings and arrows and others more resilient? And how can we help nurture those qualities of resilience and other positive features to enable people to more adaptively cope with the challenges of adversity that present themselves every day? And so this is where the work on meditation fits in. And in the early part of my career, was very much focused on the adversity side of things. And then in 1992, something happened, which, as my dear friend John Kabat-Zinn refers to, my life and career went through an orthogonal rotation. And that orthogonal rotation was produced by my encounter with this guy, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This is just a picture of him visiting our laboratory in 2001, where we were showing him modern tools for the interrogation of the human brain function and structure. And the Dalai Lama challenged me, and he said, look, you've been using tools of modern neuroscience to study anxiety and fear and depression. Why can't you use those same tools to study kindness and compassion? And I didn't have a very good answer for him, other than that it's hard. But, you know, it was hard when we began to study fear and anxiety, and I think most scientists would agree that there's been some real scientific progress in understanding the neural bases of those emotional states, so why not on the positive side of things? So that's really where we begin, and after the encounter with His Holiness in 1992, we then began to engage in these kinds of studies. And one of the very first things that we did was a very unusual study that involved bringing very long-term practitioners to the laboratory to see if there was a there. And that's where I will begin. So let me just give you an outline of what I hope to cover in the short time we have today. I'm going to talk about, just very briefly, some of our early work with expert practitioners to just give you the lay of the land and where we started. I'll then move on to consider 4 neuroscientifically investigated constituents of well-being and how different forms of meditation may impact those specific dimensions of well-being, which lead us inevitably to the view that well-being may best be conceptualized as a skill that can be cultivated through training, and the neural bases of the constituents of well-being all exhibit plasticity and can be influenced by training. I'll then move on and talk a little bit about structural differences in the brain, and here is where I will also begin to touch upon some of the very important recent pushback about issues of replicability and the importance of certain kinds of rigor in how we address these questions. I'll then talk a little bit about peripheral biology, biology below the neck, and how the circuits in the brain that we're studying may influence and be influenced by these peripheral biological systems, which may be relevant for certain aspects of physical health. And I'll then spend some time talking about methodological and conceptual challenges, which are extremely important and really are at the forefront now in research in this area. And if there's time, which I don't think there'll be, I'll mention extensions to children, but that'll probably wait for discussions later. Okay, so let's begin with expert practitioners. So we wanted to see if we brought individuals who spent an enormous number of hours training their mind, whether their brains actually looked any different as a place to begin, because if we didn't see a signal there, studying more novice individuals would potentially be more difficult and complicated. And so this is really where we started. And the Dalai Lama actually helped us recruit participants for this study. They all resided in Asia. They have spent an average of 34,000 hours in their lifetime engaged in formal practice of different kinds of meditation. So these are individuals who are extreme experts, if you will. And we started with looking at a simple practice that they do all the time, and that practice is described in the words of one of the practitioners in this way. He said, "What we've tried to do for the sake of the experiment is to generate a state in which love and compassion permeate the whole mind with no other consideration, reasoning, or discursive thoughts." Now, you know, sometimes there are those commercials on television where it says, "Don't try this at home." Well, I would encourage you, please do try this at home, but don't be frustrated if there are discursive thoughts that intrude. One of the virtues of working with these very long-term practitioners is, at least by their report, they're able to do this even in the complicated and challenging environment of a laboratory. So we looked at this with in the MRI scanner, and this is Mathieu Ricard, who is the author of that quote describing the experiment. He's a very unusual individual. He's been a Buddhist monk since 1967, but he also has a Ph.D. in molecular biology from the Pasteur Institute, where he worked with François Jacob, the Nobel laureate. And so he comes to the table with unusual credentials and has been a key to bridging these cultural divides. And this is just another picture of a practitioner where we are recording brain electrical signals. And in the very first paper that we published on the long-term practitioners, which was published in 2004 in PNAS, the first author is Antoine Lutz, who is a scientist in our lab at the time. And what you can see in this figure, if you look at the left-hand side of the figure, is a neutral resting period, and the right-hand side of the figure are just raw EEG signals. And you can see, without fancy computer extraction with the naked eye the presence of high amplitude gamma oscillations. And these gamma oscillations were quite pronounced in these long-term practitioners, and we compared them to controls who were taught this practice and practiced for 1 week before they came into the laboratory, and the gamma oscillations were much more robust in the practitioners. And very recent research, which I won't show you, it's been published, we demonstrated that these gamma oscillations actually are present during sleep in long-term practitioners. So we had participants sleep in the sleep laboratory. This is a collaboration with Giulio Tononi at Wisconsin. Tononi is a well-known sleep scientist, and we recorded high-density EEG when the practitioners were sleeping in the laboratory, and they showed the presence of gamma oscillations that were superimposed on slow-wave sleep. And so that actually helps to address some methodological issues and further substantiates this as an important signal that is present in these long-term practitioners. So this very first study really was more of a proof of concept and suggested to us that there may be something worth investigating here. Now, one of the problems with the studies in long-term practitioners is that since we have not followed these individuals longitudinally, this all could be due to self-selection. It could be to any number of things that are different about these individuals. And so from a scientific perspective, while these studies are exciting and interesting, they are ultimately unsatisfying. And we need to do other kinds of research to more rigorously address these issues in randomized controlled sorts of trials. And so for most of the remainder of my talk, that's what I'll be turning to. So I'd like to now move on to these neuroscientifically investigated constituents of well-being and say a little bit about what I mean by them. And these were presented in the 2015 World Happiness Report. This is a report that is done under the auspices of the United Nations, and this was the third World Happiness Report, and this is authored by 3 economists, and for the very first time they asked a neuroscientist, yours truly, to author one of the chapters. So it's hard to read, but this chapter that we authored is on the neuroscience of happiness or well-being. And in that chapter, we talk about 4 constituents of well-being that have been neuroscientifically investigated. And very briefly, they are resilience, and we define resilience here as the reactivity to and the recovery from adversity. Individuals who recover more quickly and perhaps show less reactivity to adversity are thought to be to have higher levels of well-being. Positive outlook is in many ways the flip side of resilience, and it has to do with the capacity to savor positive emotion, to have the positive emotion endure. And so if there's some positive emotional experience that one has, the question can be asked, how long does the afterglow, if you will, from that experience last? And I should say that each of these has been intensively investigated in terms of underlying neural bases. And I'll say more about that as we go along. But with positive outlook, we've learned a lot about this from studies of depression, actually, where depressed individuals fail to show sustained activation in the ventral striatum, and the duration of activation in the ventral striatum in several studies that we and others have done has been shown to relate to certain aspects of well-being. The third quality or constituent of well-being is attention, and this goes back to the video that Josie and I did that you saw at the beginning, and to paraphrase the subtitle of a recent major paper on attention that actually came out in Science a few years ago from a group of social psychologists at Harvard, a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And so the capacity to focus attention may be importantly associated with well-being, and I'll say more about that in a few moments. And finally, the last constituent that I'd like to note is generosity. There is now a growing neuroscientific literature that suggests that acts of generosity promote well-being, and they also activate this circuitry in the brain that has been associated with well-being. So I'm going to talk about each of these four in one way or another and ask the question how different forms of meditation practice may impact these particular constituents of well-being and their underlying neural bases. Okay, so first, resilience, the reactivity to and the rapidity of recovery following negative events. And so we've asked the question whether individual differences in this process are associated with certain kinds of negative affective traits, and also whether interventions designed to decrease negative affect, promote positive affect, such as certain kinds of meditation, may affect this process. So let me begin by illustrating two hypothetical individuals. If you imagine at time point 3 some adverse event occurring, you can plot your favorite dependent measure on the ordinate here. It could be activation in a specific brain circuit, or it could be a peripheral biological signal, or for that matter, it could be a behavioral measure. And if you look at this individual and compare it to this individual, what I illustrate is that these two individuals are showing comparable reactivity in this case, but person B is recovering more quickly. And so the question is this meaningful variance, and are these processes ones that may be impacted by different forms of meditation? So we have used a simple, what we call an implicit emotion regulation paradigm. A picture that's either negative or neutral is presented, and after some period of time it's followed by a neutral face. And one of the questions that we're asking in this kind of experiment, which, and I'm only going to go into certain features here for lack of time, but we're asking the question whether the emotion from the emotional picture spills over, if you will, and impacts the processing of a neutral face. And so we can interrogate these different time periods and begin to obtain answers to these questions. So this is showing data from a group of non-meditators. These are normal individuals. This is a sample of 129 participants, simply showing activation, robust activation in the dorsal amygdala in response to negative compared to neutral pictures. And if you look down here, we split the data into those who score highly on a self-report measure of neuroticism or anxiety, very highly correlated, and compare those to a group that scores low. The high neurotics are in red, the low in the green color, and you can see that in the latter part of the time course, they show a divergence, with the highly neurotic subject showing a slower recovery in this period, showing more amygdala signal in this period. And so these data suggest, and this works, by the way, if you look at this continuously across the entire distribution. And what these data suggest is that there's important variance that's carried in this portion of the curve. And so we tested a group of long-term meditators known as LTMs and a group of meditation-naive participants. Their age and gender matched in this case, in this paradigm. And you can see when we looked at the overall group, there actually is no difference between the meditators and the controls. However, if you split the meditators into those who have more hours of lifetime practice based on a extensive semi-structured interview that we do, so that's broken out here. Participants with the least hours of practice are in red and the most hours of practice in maroon. You can see that the participants with the greater number of hours of practice are showing a more rapid recovery compared to those who are who have the less number of hours of practice. And again, this works if you just look at this continuously as well. And it suggests that this may be a process that is impacted by longer-term practice. Now, when we interrogate these data using different analytic techniques and model the time course using a hemodynamic modeling procedure, what we see is that the meditators overall have less amygdala activity during this overall time course compared to age and gender match controls in response to negative compared to neutral pictures. And that's illustrated here in these bar plots. This just shows the distribution of the amygdala signal, and you can see that there is a statistically significant difference here, although you can also see that the distributions clearly overlap. And there are quite a few many non-meditators who are showing low levels of amygdala signal, and some meditators who are showing high levels of amygdala signal. And so while there is an overall difference between these groups, there's a lot of variability as well. One of the important questions which we have been interested in, and our basic research in affective neuroscience has motivated, is looking at circuitry that we know to be important in emotion regulation. And as part of a program of basic research on the neural bases of emotion regulation, we have been collaborating with Ned Kalin, who is a psychiatrist at Wisconsin, looking at a non-human primate model of anxious temperament. And from those data, we have gleaned some important insights, which have also been observed in human subjects regarding amygdala prefrontal interactions as they pertain to emotion regulation. So I'd like to just take a very brief diversion, show you a little bit of the data that provide the context for the questions that we're asking in meditation. So this is from a recent paper. Rasmus Byrne is a colleague at Wisconsin who actually used to be here at NIH with Peter Bandettini. And what we're looking at here is micro-PET measures of glucose metabolism in rhesus monkeys in response to a simple challenge from which anxious temperament is assessed. And what we're looking at here is relations between connectivity between the medial prefrontal cortex and the central nucleus of the amygdala. So the central nucleus of the amygdala is displayed here, and connectivity between the medial prefrontal cortex and the central nucleus of the amygdala is displayed on the abscissa. And what you can see is that the greater the connectivity between these regions, the lower the metabolic activity in the central nucleus of the amygdala. And it suggests that positively coupled connectivity between these regions is associated with modulation of the amygdala, reduced activity in the amygdala, which, as I'll show you in a moment, is in the animal model is associated with less anxiety, with lower levels of anxious temperament. In this figure here, we see the same basic relationship with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And so here, what I display is the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the central nucleus of the amygdala on the abscissa. And on the ordinate is a measure of anxious temperament that we derive from two behavioral indices. One is the duration of freezing, the other is the cessation of cooing, and the third metric is cortisol. And they're combined in a standardized measure of anxious temperament that is plotted on the ordinate. And what you can see is that greater connectivity is associated with lower levels of anxious temperament. So now the question is, do we see a similar pattern of functional connectivity that may be impacted by meditation, and how might that be related to characteristics of well-being in the human subjects? So that's what we turn to here. So what we're looking at here is connectivity between medial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And what we see is that greater connectivity between the amygdala and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is displayed on the abscissa, is related on the ordinate to less amygdala signal in response to negative pictures. And so what this suggests is that these findings very much are parallel to what we see in the rhesus monkey model, with increased connectivity being associated with lower levels of amygdala signal. And then what we have observed is that greater number of practice hours, particularly the practice that meditators report during retreat, and it's of a specific kind of meditation that we call OM, which stands for open monitoring meditation, which is a form of mindfulness meditation. And what we see is that greater number of practice hours are associated with increased connectivity between these regions. And we also find that psychological well-being is associated with this metric of connectivity. So we used the most well-validated scale that has been extensively used in the literature on psychological well-being, developed by Carol Riff, who's actually one of my colleagues at Wisconsin, and particularly the self-acceptance scale. So it has items such as, in general, I feel confident and positive about myself, and then this is negatively scored. I feel like many of the people I know have gotten more out of life than I have. When I look at the story of my life, I am pleased with how things have turned out. I made some mistakes in the past, but I feel that all in all, everything has worked out for the best. So people who score highly on this show higher levels of well-being, and what you see is that the long-term meditators compared to the meditation-naive participants score significantly more highly on this scale compared to the meditators. And so then the question that we asked is, how does this relate to these metrics of connectivity? And what we see is that, and reactivity, what we see is that greater scores on this scale, increased well-being, is associated with less reactivity in the amygdala to the negative pictures. And so these data suggest that these neural indices are related to some of the beneficial psychological changes that have been reported by these practitioners. So one of the important questions that we asked is whether a similar difference can be found in more short-term practice, and these are very new data from a study that NCCIH is supporting, comparing mindfulness-based stress reduction to a rigorous active comparison group, and I'll say more about the nature of this comparison group in a moment, a group that we call the Health Enhancement Program, and we also have a third arm in these studies, which is a weightless control. And what we see is that when we compare the MBSR to the active comparison subjects, we do see the same basic difference. We see that in the exact same paradigm. We see that after 8 weeks of training, the participants who underwent mindfulness meditation training showed significantly reduced signal in the amygdala in response to this paradigm compared to participants randomly assigned to an active comparison group, the Health Enhancement Program. So I'd like to move on now to another kind of meditation, which is compassion meditation, generating feelings of kindness and compassion toward oneself and toward others. And this really is asking the question whether the two constituents of well-being that I talked about earlier, positive outlook and generosity, can be nurtured through this kind of practice. And so we speculated early on that this might be the case. This is a review article that I wrote with Bruce McEwen in 2012, and just reading the last line of the abstract here, we said structural and functional changes in the brain have been observed with cognitive therapy and certain forms of meditation and lead to the suggestion that well-being and other pro-social characteristics might be enhanced through training. And so let me give you just one snippet of evidence for that. So this is a study that was published a couple of years ago. The first author is Helen Wang, who is now a postdoc at UCSF. She was a graduate student in our lab at the time. And we asked the question whether 2 weeks of training, and I'll give you a feel for what this training is in just a moment, in a randomized controlled trial where participants signed up and were told that this is a study about interventions designed to cultivate well-being, and you will be randomly assigned to one of two interventions. One is a condition that utilizes this compassion meditation practice that I'll describe, and the second were procedures that were derived from cognitive therapy, one of the most empirically well-validated strategies for treating anxiety and depression and cultivating well-being. These interventions were delivered over the internet. Participants logged on to a protected website, and by the way, you can go to our website and download this training for free, and you can get a taste of exactly what we presented to the participants. So they had a daily practice of 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks, and one of the virtues of delivering this online is that we can monitor exactly what they were doing, and the comparison group was taught cognitive reappraisal training. So the elements of this compassion training were this. We asked people to contemplate and visualize the suffering, and then relieving that suffering, being free of that suffering for a number of different categories of individuals. We first had them focus on a loved one. So in this case, a family member or a very close friend, someone with whom they have an uncomplicated relationship, could even be a pet, an animal. We asked them to focus on this individual and envision a time in that individual's life when she or he may have been suffering, and then cultivate the aspiration that they be relieved from that suffering. We then had them move on to themselves, to a stranger, a person whose face you recognize, but someone you don't know very well. Could be someone who works as a cashier in a cafe that you go to on a regular basis. It could be a bus driver. It could be any number of individuals, someone who lives, a neighbor who you don't know very well. So a stranger, and just imagine a time in their life when they may have been suffering and go through this same process. Finally, we have them move on to a difficult person, someone who pushes your buttons at least a little bit, someone who makes you a little bit irritated. And again, genuinely and authentically bring that individual into your mind and your heart and go through this process. And finally, as many individuals as possible, all beings. And we have them use a phrase that they silently repeat to themselves to help them. May you be free from suffering. May you experience joy and ease. We then instruct them to notice visceral sensations that may be associated with this. Often people report sensations around the heart. And we instruct them to feel the compassion emotionally and not to simply repeat the phrases cognitively. And the way this experiment went is we randomized participants to either a compassion group or a reappraisal group. We brought them into the lab and gave them, had them go through an fMRI scan where we were specifically interrogating circuitry associated with emotion and empathy. And we had them go then through training, 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks. And then we had them come back for a second MRI scan. And at that time, we also gave them some behavioral/neuroeconomic decision-making tasks to get an objective measure of pro-social or altruistic behavior. So that's the basic experimental design, and participants were randomly assigned to these groups, having signed up again for an experiment that they knew would involve one of two interventions designed to cultivate well-being. So this is the economic game that we used, and I won't go through this in detail, but it's a version of the dictator game, but it involves a third party who is observing the interaction between a dictator and a recipient. And when the dictator makes an unfair transaction and basically is giving much less to the recipient than otherwise might occur. The third party, who is our subject in this case, has the opportunity to use some of her or his own money to render that transaction to be more altruistic. So that's the basic logic of this game. And after 2 weeks of compassion training, participants randomly assigned to the compassion group behave more altruistically on this economic decision-making task compared to those who go through the cognitive reappraisal training. And with respect to the brain, it turns out that there are changes in the brain that occur from time 1 to time 2 over the course of this 2 weeks, functional changes in the brain that predict the extent to which the participants are behaving prosocially, with greater changes, in this case, in prefrontal and parietal cortices predicting changes in altruistic behavior, increases in altruistic behavior for the compassion group compared to the reappraisal group. We also see changes in important circuitry that we've identified in other basic studies as being critical to this positive outlook feature of well-being and is associated with psychological measures of well-being, and that is the connectivity between prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, in this case specifically the nucleus accumbens, which is strengthened by compassion training compared to reappraisal training. I want to now move on in the interests of time and talk a little bit about attention. In the video, you heard this quote from William James. This is really one of my all-time favorite quotes in the biobehavioral sciences. And when William James said an education which should improve this faculty, talking about attention, would be the education par excellence, those italics are in the original William James. And the last sentence, which I didn't mention on the video, I'll read to you. He said, "It is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about." I think if William James had more familiarity with the contemplative traditions, he would have instantaneously seen that these are strategies that can be used to educate attention. So let me just give you one little snippet of evidence for this. Before I do that, let me just remind you that one of the important behavioral signs of inattention is reaction time variability. It's a good behavioral metric that reflects mind wandering. And so these are response time distributions. They're histograms. And what you see here is that I've circled is a distribution for a group of children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and in blue is circled age-matched controls. And what you can see is that the response time distribution for controls is much tighter. And it simply means their reaction time is less variable. And so we use this metric in a selective attention task where we look longitudinally over the course of 3 months of mindfulness meditation training to ascertain whether there are behavioral changes of this sort and whether there are corresponding changes in the brain that are associated with these behavioral changes. And so this is work, again, of Antoine Lutz, a scientist in our lab. And if you just look at the right-hand bars here, practitioners are those who went through 3 months of mindfulness training. And the light bar is time 1 before the training. The dark bar is after 3 months of training. And these are age and gender match controls who did 1 week of training between these 2 assessments that were 3 months apart. And what the metric is here is the standard deviation of reaction time. So this is a measure of reaction time variability. Lower numbers mean less variable, smaller standard deviation. And so what you can see is that the meditators who went through 3 months of training show a very significant reduction in reaction time variability, whereas the controls are showing no significant difference between time 1 and time 2. We measured various parameters of brain electrical activity, and particularly looking at phase locking of the external stimulus to oscillatory rhythms that we record from the scalp surface. And I, again, won't go through all the details. These are published data. But what we see is that there are changes in frontal phase locking such that the meditators are showing increased phase locking after 3 months of practice. And that increased phase locking, which is displayed on the ordinate here, is associated with a reduction in reaction time variability, meaning that reaction time becomes less variable. And this is one of many, many studies now which suggest that there are measurable changes on certain parameters of attention which can be improved through these simple practices of mindfulness meditation. Okay, let me say a little about structural differences in the brain here. This is a meta-analysis and review that came out in 2014 on structural differences in the brain. And I just want to read you, and they report a moderate, medium effect size of these structural differences. But I want to read to you the last sentence of this abstract, which is very important, or the last 2 sentences. They say, publication bias and methodological limitations are strong concerns, however. Further research using rigorous methods is required to definitively link meditation practice to altered brain morphology. So I just want to share with you some very recent data where we've really carefully looked at this in a group of rigorously screened participants who are randomly assigned in a 3-arm study to either mindfulness-based stress reduction, our active comparison group, the health enhancement program, or weightless controls, looking at specific regions of the brain where previous structural differences have been reported. And I'll go through this kind of quickly. So this is in the amygdala, and these are the sample sizes here, and I also report the effect sizes. And so there's absolutely no difference in amygdala volume among these 3 groups. There's absolutely no difference in the insula among these 3 groups. Here's the effect size. You would need about 30,000 participants to detect a difference with these effect sizes. In the superior frontal gyrus, absolutely no difference. And in the posterior cingulate, absolutely no difference. And so this is just a cautionary note that I think that while there are certainly some trials that have reported structural differences with 2 months of mindfulness-based stress reduction, I think we need to be very cautious at this point in time and to acknowledge that there may indeed have been biases in which trials have gotten published. We fully intend to publish these data as soon as possible. They've just been analyzed. But I think that to expect there to be robust structural differences after what amounts to 24 hours of practice over the course of 8 weeks is a little bit unrealistic. And so stay tuned, and I'm sure there'll be lots of investigators who will be looking at this. Oh, and this is, sorry, the middle temporal gyrus, also absolutely no difference. Okay, a little bit on peripheral biology. This is an area that's potentially very, very exciting because of its obvious health implications, and there has been controversy about whether psychological well-being is related to physical health, but if you look at large epidemiological studies, particularly, for example, the Whitehall studies from the UK, there is very good evidence that individuals who report higher levels of psychological well-being do show certain positive metrics with respect to health, physical health. Again, the precise mechanisms through which that occurs are not known, but there have been those kinds of associations reported in the past. We got excited about this because our very first randomized controlled trial of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which turned out to be actually the very first randomized controlled trial ever of MBSR, which was published in 2013. It's 2003, rather. Remarkable that the first randomized controlled trial of MBSR was published in 2003. And what we did is we administered influenza vaccine and looked at antibody titers mounted in response to the vaccine, and we found that the meditators showed higher levels of antibody titers mounted in response to the vaccine compared to age and gender matched, and these were weightless controls, so it's not a great control group that we used back then. But nevertheless, this was an early finding that suggested that there might be something interesting with respect to peripheral biology. Since then, there have been lots of studies, and we as well have pursued this. And this is a very recent report from our group. Melissa Rosenkrantz, who actually has a K Award from NCCIH and is a scientist in our group, has been looking at inflammatory mechanisms. She has developed a procedure using the local administration of capsaicin cream, which produces an inflammatory flare, to quantify experimentally inflammation and to look at the impact of mindfulness procedures on this local inflammation. And so we've done several studies, from a study published in 2013, you can see the capsaicin cream, and we also in that study used a vacuum procedure to produce these very, very small blisters from which we can extract blister fluid to look at pro-inflammatory cytokines in the fluid that were associated with the rate at which the flare resolved. And we used digital photography to simply quantify the flare size in an automated way. And in this very recent study that was just published, what you can see is that long-term practitioners compared to age and gender matched controls are showing, we're looking at cortisol here, and this is flare size. They're showing reduced flare size and also reduced cortisol in response to the Trier social stress task. And it turns out that cortisol is also related to perceived stress in the Trier social stress task. That's what TSST stands for here in both the non-meditators and the meditators. And in very recent work also, we have been specifically interested in whether we can see evidence of rapid changes in gene expression for genes that are extracted, that we look at in peripheral blood mononuclear cells, genes that are specifically implicated in inflammation. And so in a study that we published in 2014, the first author is Perla Koloman from Barcelona, molecular biologist in Barcelona. We looked at a number of genes implicated in inflammation over the course of a day of intensive meditation practice. This is 8 hours of practice. And we had matched controls come in for a day of leisure, where they were sedentary for the day, they ate the same diet, and we can see some evidence of changes in gene expression in the meditators who are in red here, downregulation of genes involved in inflammation compared to the controls who are not showing any significant change. And these changes in gene expression are related to changes in cortisol over the course of the Trier social stress task that is administered on a separate occasion. So I want to end now with some challenges to research in this area. I'll end on a positive note, but I do want to be open and honest about these challenges. I've written about them as well as a number of other people have written about them. This is a paper that came out in 2015 in the American Psychologist, where we review some of the conceptual and methodological challenges to research in this area. This is a paper that just very recently came out a couple of weeks ago in PLOS One that's receiving a lot of attention. And this is a paper that analyzed the data on trials of mindfulness meditation for mental health changes, and reported a publication bias based on the looking at the effect size and the number of positive trials that have been reported. Excuse me. This paper in PLOS One was picked up in Nature, and this was a news article in Nature. And the subtitle here, Trials of Mindfulness to Improve Mental Health, Selectively Report Positive Results. This is a very important issue. So I want to just talk a little bit about using adequate comparison groups, the impossibility of conducting double-blind randomized controlled trials with meditation, because someone who's assigned to a meditation group obviously knows what the intervention is that they're receiving, so they cannot be blind to it. The issue of publication bias, issue of small effect sizes and poor experimental design, heterogeneity of participants, and also how we can better measure mindfulness. I'm not going to be able to cover all of these in detail, but I just want to give you a little bit of a feel for this. So in 2012, we published a paper reporting on and presenting an active comparison control for mindfulness-based stress reduction. We put a lot of time and energy into developing this comparison treatment. We call it the Health Enhancement Program, and it's a comparison group that is matched in every possible way in terms of group involvement. It involves light physical exercise, music-induced relaxation, nutritional information. It has the same amount of practice. Most importantly, we actually match the enthusiasm of the instructors in their confidence that this intervention will promote well-being. And the extent to which they believe that is comparable to the instructors who teach MBSR. That's really important. And what we reported in this paper is that on every self-report measure that, or virtually every self-report measure that had been used to study MBSR, we find no difference between MBSR and the active comparison group. So this is a sobering reminder that at least some of the variance in reported changes in response to MBSR may be associated with nonspecific effects of an intervention. We do see other differences, and in this particular paper, we had a pain protocol, and we see differences in certain aspects of pain responsivity. This was an important paper that was published in 2014 in JAMA Internal Medicine on a systematic review and meta-analysis of programs to relieve, meditation-based programs to relieve stress and promote well-being. And there are two tables from this paper that really capture the data here. The first table is this, and you don't have to know what's in here. These are just different conditions like anxiety and depression. But if you look here, this is reporting the effect size, and if it's to the left, it favors meditation. And these are trials with nonspecific controls, like weightless controls. Now, I contrast this with a summary of those studies that have used active controls. You see here. And so the importance of using these active comparison groups is absolutely critical if we want to assign specificity to the essential ingredients that we think may be producing change. And so again, a very important reminder of the importance of doing it this way. And finally, I just want to end with how we can better measure mindfulness. And we published a paper a couple of years ago that presents a very simple behavioral procedure that involves breath counting. And the essential elements of this is the following. If I ask you to tap a key, or for that matter, we do it on an iPad now, tap with every breath cycle. Just simply tap each time you have an inhalation. It turns out that when you measure objectively respiration in the laboratory, your ability to tap in relation to your breathing is virtually perfect. Correlations exceed 0.98 in every normal sample we've looked at. People could do this very accurately. However, we then ask them to tap a second finger or another key every nth breath, say every ninth breath. And when you ask them to make that second tap every ninth breath, they make mistakes. And they make mistakes that coincide with reports of mind wandering. And so this is showing data on errors in counting that are associated with experience sampling reports of being on task or off task. This is a measure of mind wandering. And what you can see is that higher error rates are associated with more mind wandering. In addition, we have looked at relations between measures of meta-awareness, that is the awareness of making mistakes, for example, and of being aware that you are aware, and counting accuracy is associated with improved meta-awareness, and also this is another measure of mind wandering here, and these are just two independent samples. We also see that there's good test-retest reliability. People who are good at counting accuracy one week are good in another week. We also compared experienced meditators to novices, and the experienced meditators do better on this task. And so these data, there are more data that we have in this paper too that establish the construct validity of this measure. And this is a simple measure that can be inserted excuse me, into clinical trials, and they can substitute for, or at least complement, self-report measures of mindfulness, which we just published a paper questioning the construct validity of those self-report measures of mindfulness. If you have someone in a mindfulness intervention and then you ask them on a self-report measure about how mindful they are, the answers that you get are not going to be that scientifically meaningful. And so we think that this kind of behavioral measure may be a very useful addition at the very least. Okay, so I'm going to skip this extension to children since we don't have time, and I want to just refer you to our center website, centerhealthyminds.org, for more information. And I want to end with a quote from a book that was on the bestseller list for a while that really, I think, captures the possibilities and opportunities in this area. And this was actually written by the Dalai Lama in his book, The Art of Happiness. But actually, before I do that, let me just say, these days I am just a simple mouthpiece for an amazingly talented group of scientists in our lab that I am grateful for every single day. This is what the Dalai Lama had to say about this. He said, the systematic training of the mind, the cultivation of happiness, the genuine inner transformation by deliberately selecting and focusing on positive mental states and challenging negative mental states is possible because of the very structure and function of the brain. But the wiring in our brains is not static, not irrevocably fixed. Our brains are also adaptable. Thank you very much.
So thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you,
So I
George.
want to take 5 minutes for a few questions for Dr. Davidson before, and then I want to invite all of you to a poster session where we have some of the meditation work we support going to be presented. But we have time for a few questions. Yes.
How do you suppose that long-term meditators who show reductions in amygdala reactivity might respond in a situation that's truly dangerous, in which activation might be advantageous?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and there are a couple of instructive examples. When you look at the responsivity to physical pain in long-term practitioners, we published a study a couple of years ago where we look at physical pain. This is in response to thermal pain, and we have a period where they anticipate receiving the pain, the actual noxious stimulus itself, the nociceptive stimulus, and then a recovery period. And what we find is that during the anticipation period, they show very little reactivity in the pain matrix. During the actual thermal pain itself, the thermal stimulus, in some regions of the pain matrix, for example, somatosensory cortex, they actually show significantly increased reactivity. But then they recover very quickly. And so it may be that a lot of the variance associated with suffering is captured in the anticipation and the recovery periods, but during the actual critical event, they may show high levels of reactivity. And if we had the right kind of temporal resolution, we may be able to capture it. And so my intuition is that during a situation where there was truly a dangerous stimulus, they would in fact show reactivity in the appropriate networks, but the reactivity wouldn't linger beyond the point where it was useful. That's a conjecture, but that is something that can be empirically investigated. So thank you for the good question.
Next question, stay at that mic.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Davidson. I'm very excited to see you. I've heard a lot about you, and so nice to see you in person, and thank you for all of your work.
Thank you very much.
I work in leadership development here at NIH, so I'm very interested in how this research could impact how we train future leaders, both leaders, leaders at all levels, really. And so I'm wondering, from your research, is there enough evidence to suggest that we can start exploring how mindfulness can be included in leadership development? How might you suggest that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I certainly am extremely interested in that area. I think that there is opportunity to explore that. My own conjecture is that some of these practices may be very helpful to leaders, and one of the things that we don't know is what the appropriate dosing is, if you will, to produce meaningful effects. And it may be that you can sprinkle very short periods of practice throughout a workday in a way that can actually mesh well with a very active work life and still produce beneficial change, which may be a useful strategy for leaders. This is something that I think really warrants serious investigation. I think there's enough evidence that we have now to suggest that there is some promise, and we need to investigate it seriously.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, are there any organizations that use meditation to work with autistic children?
It's a good question. I don't know of any organizations. I do know of some specific individual research efforts that are being now conducted to explore elements of certain kinds of meditation for children on the autism spectrum. I don't know of any published data yet. So I do think that there are some good scientists who are starting to look at this, and I think in the next several years we'll see some published data on this issue.
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions, and then we welcome everyone to join us at our poster session. Go ahead, please.
Thanks. Do you know of any examples of advanced practitioners of meditation doing neurofeedback tasks? You showed that there are clear differences in advanced practitioners, with these certain biomarkers. But do you know of any examples of like using real-time neurofeedback, and are advanced practitioners able to do it, better?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. The scientist who's doing the most work with that, rigorously is Judd Brewer, who is at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, and he's been looking at feedback from the posterior cingulate, and has a little bit of data that I've seen with longer-term practitioners. I don't think it's been published yet, but it's sort of really just beginning. So I don't think we really know the answer to that.
Thanks.
And from this mic?
Thanks. Hi, has work in your center touched on epilepsy and seizure conditions at all?
We have not studied epilepsy or seizure conditions. I do know of a group in Lyon, France, that is now looking at the impact of meditation specifically on seizure activity in seizure-prone individuals, but I don't know of any published data. So again, lots of opportunity, but we're still at a very early stage in this work. So thank you all very much.